Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. We're talking short stories today.
Yes, short stories, they can be so powerful, so impactful, but sometimes it feels like there's just not enough space to really get going.
Yeah, you've got this great idea, but how do you actually make it sing in just a few pages? How do you build a whole world and characters people really care about without having like a whole novel to work with? That's what we're going to dig into today. We've got some great sources lined up to help us unpack, the real techniques that elevate a short story from just a quick read to something that sticks with you.
Absolutely. We're going to focus on 5 key elements that keep popping up in our research. Think of them as the building blocks of a truly captivating short story.
Okay, cool. So where do we even begin? What's the first thing to tackle when you're trying to craft the story that really draws the reader in?
Well, for me, it always starts with the characters. In a short story, you don't have the luxury of slowly revealing who someone is over hundreds of pages. You need to make them feel real, relatable right from the start.
Yeah, that makes sense. So how do you do that? How do you breathe life into a character when you're working with limited space?
One technique that our sources highlight is the idea of internal conflict, giving a character a struggle that's going on within themselves, beneath the surface. It could be conflicting desires, hidden fears, a moral dilemma, anything that creates tension within them.
I see. So it's not just about what they do, it's about what they're grappling with internally. It's like adding another dimension to them.
Exactly. It makes them feel more human, more relatable. Think about it. The most interesting people you know are usually the ones who have some kind of complexity to them. They're not just one thing. They're full of contradictions and internal struggles.
Okay, so how does this actually play out in a short story? Could you give us an example?
Sure, let's say you have a character who's outwardly very successful. They've got the great job, the nice house, the perfect family. But internally, they're deeply unhappy. Maybe they feel trapped, unfulfilled. That internal conflict creates a tension that makes them much more interesting than if they were just a generic, successful person.
Right, because now there's a disconnect between how they appear and how they actually feel. And that makes us want to know more about them, to understand what's going on beneath the surface.
Exactly, and that's the kind of hook that can really draw a reader in. Another technique that's super effective is using small, specific details to convey emotions. Instead of just telling us how a character feels, show us through their actions, their habits, their little quirks.
Like instead of saying he was angry, you might show him clenching his fist or
Hmm.
pacing back and forth.
Right. Or maybe he always scratches the back of his neck when he's nervous. Or she twirls her hair when she's thinking. These are small details, but they can be so revealing. They allow the reader to infer the character's emotional state without being explicitly told.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. It's about showing, not telling, but in a really subtle, nuanced way.
Precisely. And it's these little details that make characters feel real and memorable. They're the things that stick in our minds long after we've finished reading.
Okay, so for our listeners who are working on their own stories, what kind of details should they be looking for?
Pay attention to people around you. How do they express themselves? What are their little habits and mannerisms? You can use real life observations as inspiration for your characters. And don't be afraid to give them quirks. Those little things that make them unique and stand out.
Great advice. Now, let's move on to another crucial element of short story writing, the hook. That opening that grabs the reader's attention and makes them want to keep reading. What are some effective ways to create a killer hook?
Well, one classic technique is to start with an unexpected situation or an intriguing question, something that immediately throws the reader off balance and makes them wonder what's going on.
Could you give us some examples?
Yeah. Sure. Think about an opening line like, "The day she found the talking cat in her garden was the day her life changed forever." Or how about this? "Why did he keep that dusty old photo hidden in his desk drawer?" These openings create an immediate sense of mystery and intrigue.
I see. So you're basically setting up a puzzle that the reader wants to solve,
Yeah.
and that keeps them hooked.
Exactly. It's like dangling a carrot in front of them. You're promising something interesting, something unexpected.
Our sources mention Shirley Jackson's The Lottery as a great example of a subtle but effective hook. It starts with a seemingly ordinary village gathering, but there's this underlying sense of unease. How does that work?
Well, Jackson masterfully creates a contrast between the mundane and the sinister. She describes the everyday details of the gathering, the children playing, the adults chatting, but there are these subtle hints that something isn't quite right. And that creates a sense of foreboding, of anticipation.
So it's not about a shocking opening, but about creating an atmosphere that makes the reader lean in and pay attention.
Exactly. Sometimes the most effective hooks are the ones that slowly draw you in, that make you feel like you're being let in on a secret.
Okay, so for our listeners who are brainstorming their own openings, what are some things they can do to make their hooks more effective?
Think about the tone you want to set. Do you want to create a sense of mystery, of suspense, of humor, and then think about how you can convey that tone through your opening lines. Remember, the hook is your first impression, so make it count.
All right, let's move on to setting. It's easy to think of setting as just the backdrop for a story, but our sources argue that it can be so much more.
Yeah, setting can be a really powerful tool, especially in a short story where you're trying to create a whole world in just a few pages.
So how do you make setting more than just a backdrop? How do you make it come alive and really contribute to the story?
One technique that our sources emphasize is engaging all five senses in your descriptions. Instead of just telling us that a place is beautiful or scary, show us what the character sees, hears, smells, tastes, and feels.
I see. So it's about creating a sensory experience for the reader. It's about immersing them in the world of the story.
Exactly. For example, imagine you're writing a scene that takes place in a bustling marketplace. You could describe the vibrant colors of the fruits and vegetables, the aroma of spices in the air, the sound of vendors hawking their wares, the feel of the cobblestones beneath the character's feet.
Okay, that paints a much more vivid picture than just saying the marketplace was crowded.
Another technique is to make the setting itself a part of the conflict. Have it actively influence the events of the story or the character's choices.
Could you give us an example of that?
Sure, imagine a story set in a remote cabin during a blizzard. The characters are trapped inside, unable to leave, and the blizzard itself becomes a character, a force that they have to contend with. It creates a sense of claustrophobia and danger.
Right, so the setting isn't just a passive backdrop. It's an active participant in the story. Our sources mention the yellow wallpaper as a great example of this.
hmm
How does the setting function in that story?
Well, in the yellow wallpaper, the setting is a room where the protagonist is confined, and the wallpaper itself becomes a symbol of her deteriorating mental state. It's a really powerful example of how setting can reflect the internal world of a character.
That's fascinating. So for our listeners who are working on their own stories, what are some things they can do to make their settings more effective?
Think about the mood you want to create. How can the setting reinforce that mood? And how can you make the setting an integral part of the conflict? Can it create obstacles for the characters? Can it reveal something about them?
Now, let's talk about conflict. It's the heart of any good story, and short stories are no exception.
Right, conflict is what drives the narrative forward. It's what creates tension and keeps the reader engaged.
Our sources talk about the importance of having both internal and external conflict. Can you explain the difference?
Sure, internal conflict is the struggle that a character has within themselves. It's their doubts, their fears, their desires. External conflict, on the other hand, is the struggle that a character has with something outside of themselves. It could be another character, society, nature, fate, you name it.
And why is it important to have both types of conflict?
Well, internal conflict often drives the external conflict. A character's inner struggles can lead them to make choices that create external conflict. And conversely, external conflict can force a character to confront their internal struggles.
Okay, so they're interconnected. And our sources also talk about the importance of having unexpected outcomes in conflict. Why is that so crucial?
Well, predictable conflict leads to predictable stories, and predictable stories are boring. If we can see the resolution coming a mile away, there's no tension, no suspense. Unexpected outcomes keep us on the edge of our seats. They make us question our assumptions and wonder what's going to happen next.
The short story, The Gift of the Magi, has a really powerful and unexpected ending. What makes the conflict in that story so resonant?
Well, the conflict in The Gift of the Magi is driven by love and sacrifice. And the unexpected twist at the end highlights the irony of the situation and deepens the emotional impact.
So for our listeners who are developing the conflicts in their own stories, what are some things they should keep in mind?
Think about the stakes. What does your character stand to lose or gain? And how can you create unexpected twists and turns that will keep the reader engaged? What are the consequences of their choices? What are the unforeseen obstacles they might encounter?
Now let's talk about endings. The last lines of a short story are your final chance to leave a lasting impression on the reader. What makes a good ending?
Well, a good ending should provide a sense of closure, but it doesn't necessarily mean tying up every loose end. It should resonate with the themes of the story and leave the reader with something to think about.
Our sources mention ending with an unexpected truth. How does that work?
Well, an unexpected truth can recontextualize the entire story. It can force the reader to look back on everything that's happened with a new understanding, and that can be incredibly powerful.
Another approach is to leave an open question for the reader to ponder. How do you do that effectively without it feeling unfinished?
An open ending should still feel complete in a thematic sense. It might leave a specific question unanswered, but it should do so in a way that encourages the reader to keep thinking about the story and its implications.
Roald Dahl's Lamb to the Slaughter has a really memorable and somewhat disturbing ending. What makes it so impactful?
The ending of Lamb to the Slaughter is a great example of dark humor and irony. It's a twist that you don't see coming, and it leaves you with a chilling sense of the protagonist's ruthlessness.
So for our listeners who are crafting their own endings, what are some things they should consider?
Think about the emotional impact you want to create. Do you want to leave the reader feeling satisfied, unsettled, hopeful, or something else entirely? And how can you use your ending to reinforce the themes of your story or pose a final thought-provoking question?
Before we wrap up, our sources also highlight Gabriel Garcia Marquez's A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. What makes that story so effective?
A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings is a great example of magical realism. It blends the ordinary and the extraordinary in a way that makes you question the nature of reality. And it reminds us that short stories can be a powerful vehicle for exploring big ideas.
Now let's address a couple of common questions that writers often have about short stories. First, what's the ideal length?
Well, there's no hard and fast rule, but generally speaking, short stories tend to be between 1,000 and 7,500 words. Of course, there are exceptions, but that's a good range to aim for.
And how do you know if your short story is actually good?
The best way to know if your story is working is to get feedback from others. Share it with trusted readers, friends, family, writing group members, and ask them for honest critiques.
Okay, great advice. So to recap, we've talked about 5 key elements of short story writing: creating believable characters, crafting a compelling hook, utilizing setting effectively, building engaging conflict, and creating a powerful ending.
And we've seen how these elements can work together to create truly captivating and unforgettable stories.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into short story writing. We hope you found it helpful and inspiring. And if you have a short story that you're working on, or if you're just feeling inspired to write something new, we'd love to hear about it. You can connect with us at placeholder for email or social media link.
And as you continue your writing journey, remember to experiment, to take risks, and to have fun.
That's great advice. Thanks again for tuning in. Until next time, happy writing.